Thank you so much, Juliana, for giving us this great example and also for explaining to us that we are actually joining all the narrative. Because one thing that strikes me most in these times of constant flux and transformation when we talk about generative AI is really that we are all joining on developing a narrative. And that requires, of course, a lot of learning and engaging with knowledge, where we are all learners in this context. So I'm presenting today some insights and recommendations that emerged from an Erasmus Plus project called TaLAI. TaLAI stands for Teaching and Learning with AI in Higher Education. And in this consortium, we conducted a collective literature review. And from that, I will give you some insights into institutional support, what is required for teaching and learning with generative AI, and what can be learned from the literature when it comes to developing policies and effective governance for the use of generative AI in higher education. So you can see very much we have gotten first a beautiful example from Juliana, how it's done in practice, and I will just, so to say, summarize what we actually observe in the literature, and you will see that what's taking place in Italy is actually echoed by the literature as well. So this literature review, just to contextualize for you a little bit, was a collective systematic literature review of qualitative nature. We identified a total of 102 peer-reviewed papers that were published between 2022 and 2024, and the review was conducted between March and July of this year. The whole analysis was guided by predefined themes. So we looked at what recommendations can we get from these papers in terms of learning objectives, teaching and learning activities, curriculum development, and institutional support. Now, given the limited scope of this presentation here, I will focus on the fourth topic, institutional support. But soon we will publish these findings, and if you're interested in this, I'll be happy to share with you insights, and you can also have a look at our websites and keep connected with us, of course. Now, in the following, as I said, I will present to you some of these recommendations that we observed in these 102 papers. And in the footnotes, you find numbers, and these numbers give you a bit of a frequency indication how many papers recommended the following. So it gives a bit more, perhaps, validity or strength to some of those recommendations. Starting with the institutional support for teaching and learning, what we need to consider is there are, of course, three important pillars. One is the infrastructure that we need to consider in higher education. We need to think about the resources. And of course, we need to think about training, all aspects that we have as well learned about from Juliana. Now, looking at the first pillar, infrastructure, the foundation is, of course, to develop in a higher education institution an organizational culture that is open and favorable to the utilization of generative AI. With that in mind, then we can develop a solid infrastructure. And based on this infrastructure to develop this, we need, of course, resources. Financial investments are really important. And it is also recommended to think about customizable tools. For example, to cater for individual learning paths, but also to provide maybe in the future more needs-oriented assistance for students, but also for teaching staff to deal with generative AI. After all, we are dealing with a context where every day we are getting to know new tools, and this, of course, requires as well a certain level of flexibility. The most important resource that is discussed at the moment in the literature is definitely the development of a AI or generative AI policy. Training is required for everyone. we need to think here about AI literacy, but also about not only how to use those different tools, but also what Juliana said, to think about the deeper layers, to learn about, for example, academic or economic and political interests that are as well shaping the narrative of using AI or generative AI in higher education context. And I think that's also a very important aspect to include in the training that we deliver for our teaching staff and also for the students. So ethics and academic integrity plays as well a huge role in the nature of this kind of training that we would deliver. To foster this open culture for generative AI's usability in higher education context, of course, we need to have certain values, such as innovation, like Da Vinci had. We need to engage with the broader community, think about multi-stakeholder engagement. And of course, we need to have an inclusive mindset. So inclusion should be a value that should be celebrated when you want to foster an open culture for generative AI in higher education. The literature recommends here communities of practice and considering as well, for example, funding pilot projects. We have learned from one very interesting study now conducted by Juliana how this can be done, kind of research projects. And if they would be funded by higher education institutions themselves, it is a motivating factor as well. Regular meetings or feedback sessions for teaching staff, and also giving teaching staff the opportunity actually to exchange experience and reflect together on their practices with experts can also be beneficial. Moreover, roundtables, as we see it taking place in FAU, can be also very useful tool to establish communities of practice. Interdisciplinarity is really important. Juliana also mentioned it. It's very different how generative AI is applied in the different science. So we can learn a lot from each other. And this exchange is very important, that this is fostered, that not every discipline is in their own bubble, but actually that we foster this exchange. And valuing as well and discussing in this context the integration of AI in curriculum, should we give credits for it and things like that. Multi-stakeholder approach means, of course, that universities should not operate only in their own bubble, but that they should actually embrace networks with other higher education institutions, learning from them how they are actually approaching it, and also creating not only connections with other institutions, but most importantly, also with the students. So I think it's really important, and that was also nice to see from the studies being done so far, that the student perspectives are also really significant in the development of fostering a community of practice. And of course, this open culture and a strong, effective infrastructure for generative AI would perhaps be best utilized if we ensure that generative AI is democratized, widespread, and reflective, of course, on the latest technology, that we keep pace with the changes that we are observing every day, and also that we ensure that the training is aligned with those changes that we are observing in the technological advancements. And here, of course, a good way to approach, besides training, could also be to conduct information campaigns about or on AI. So we ensure that the entire higher education institution community is also always aware of the latest updates. A little bit more about faculty engagement here with a special focus on teachers, because we do see different perspectives. On the one hand, some people embrace it immediately in their teaching and learning practice. I can speak for myself. When in November 23 AI came out, we were in the midst of one semester, and immediately I also started preparing for the summer semester to utilize those kind of tools and start engaging in the dialogue, not only with my colleagues, but most importantly with my students. So from a higher education institution perspective, and that's what we learned from the literature, we need to cater for two things. On the one hand, we're embracing already the next step, which is assessment, using generative AI in assessment. So those who have already experimented now in this 1.5 years have, of course, now a curiosity into how generative AI can be utilized for assessment. On the other hand, I know that there are still as well teaching staff that have not explored generative AI or AI in general that much. So there's a certain element as well of denial or lack of time, and sometimes perhaps even anxiety. So techno stress, every day something new comes out. It creates a little bit of pressure for one or the others, and these should be tailored and addressed as well if you want to create this open culture to foster use of AI and also to ensure inclusion, so that we tailor as well for the vast variety of needs that we have in higher education institutions. So encouragement and motivation for teaching staff is key. And we learn from the literature that, for example, educators could be motivated to proactively replace traditional coursework that can be done via training, for example. And here again, really focusing on replacing only things where we know that they can still foster this critical thinking that is so important to nurture in higher education. And that is also aligned with what Juliana said, or her findings concluded, that indeed, when we focus on utilizing generative AI for creative and critical engagement, it avoids these academic integrity problems. So really fostering the replacement here for alternatives that foster critical thinking is really a useful way forward. We also learned from the literature that making or motivating educators to make an ethical commitment to themselves and to their profession can be useful, so that it is a value not to use generative AI as a stand-in for the teaching and research work. And that is indeed an important recommendation when we're considering in particular the spike of publications worldwide that we have seen since generative AI exists. Another recommendation that we found was motivating staff deeply to engage with generative AI tools so that they can actually integrate it into their instructional design in a way that benefits the students. So again, activating their critical and creative thinking skills. And of course, we could also think about some incentives. One paper suggested that could be done through praise, it could be done through promotion, or even monetary incentives. Having said all that, I think the most important recommendation is that we keep in mind we are in constant flux and transformation, and the integration of generative AI in teaching and learning really necessitates an ongoing process of learning, being flexible and adjustable to new circumstances that will arrive in our societal context, and of course constantly reflect critically about the ethical implications of using those kind of tools. And that brings us to another important theme that we observed in the literature, which is ethical and academic integrity. Here, transparency, and I know Juliana also mentioned that, is a very important aspect. It's important that faculty members know where their students' data is going and how to secure it when it's needed. This kind of information is the only way of how we can actually ensure accountability moving forward. We learned from Juliana as well that monitoring and researching use of generative AI is important. So here we see as well that learning from the experience of our members in higher education institutions can be incredibly valuable. And it was interesting to note that whenever we encountered papers that talked about plagiarism detection softwares, there was a very cautious approach towards it. And they would say, okay, communicate that this should be used cautiously or avoided even if possible. So that's what we learned from that. And of course, we could to start thinking again more consciously about academic integrity and what challenges we are having now with the reality of generative AI. As that dialogue is incredibly important. Another paper recommended perhaps even to establish academic integrity committees and perhaps generative AI free zones that can be utilized for teaching practices. Most important, however, is that we encourage teaching staff to be explicit about their expectations. We know from Rousseau that most problems occur in general because we are not clear about what we expect from others. And that is really true when it comes to using generative AI. I can speak from my own experience. Students have huge uncertainties about it. They're not even sure if they could be honest about how they use it or not. And personally, I think, and the literature also says this, nine papers recommended that out of 102, that we need to be really clear when we set an assignment about our expectations. What is allowed in terms of using generative AI and what is not allowed? And I think the more transparent and explicit, and of course, very important, realistic we are about this, the more we will enable the students as well to come to terms with academic integrity and transparency, being transparent as well about the usage of it. But this, of course, requires from the teacher side to set clear parameters for that. And that brings me to the last thematic area of my presentation, which is crafting policies and looking into how can we develop an effective governance and responsible governance of generative AI in higher education. Now, deliberative democracy, making, of course, decisions collectively involving stakeholders and discussing these, offers for higher education institutions an approach where we can really engage in this meaningful student and staff consultation. And ultimately, this will also foster this organizational culture of open-mindedness, of flexibility, of adapting and embracing it. Here, very interesting is that any development of policies or guidelines should be always based on experience and perception of all faculty members. And I think Juliana has provided a very beautiful example of how research in this manner can be done. It was also very interesting to observe that there were quite a few papers that advocated for a strong collaboration with the students. And indeed, this is what we're also seeing. Lots of papers are being published, focusing really on the student perspectives. But here again, they are very different from discipline to discipline. It depends as well on how they use it. So, and holistic studies, I think looking at how students perceiving this and using this can be really effective. And as mentioned before, international multi-stakeholder approaches, working with different jurisdictions to hopefully develop in the future this or some kind of universally accepted regulation, if that is even possible, can be important to develop these policies or guidelines. Higher education institutions can also ensure that the regulatory burdens are low. This can be done, for example, by streamlining compliance processes or leveraging technology to do so. And this can also help to maintain this flexibility, the adaptability to the constant changes that we're observing in this current context. Yeah, and of course, when we talk about academic integrity, any higher education institution has existing policies, has perhaps guidelines on that. Those should be revised in this context and updated. And yeah, perhaps needless to say, in the context of new public management, is to ensure that any new policy or guideline is always aligned with the strategic goals and the mission and vision of the university. We have seen this as a beautiful example just before. And I think that's the most, it's very important in order to be successful, and also to develop a consistent infrastructure and open culture. Yeah, this was it from my side. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I'm curious to hear about your comments and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.